Hey guys, this is Brian here. This is the first board that hobbyist board that I've successfully soldered together, completed, and I wanted to share a couple of observations with the process. I'm just actually just going to shut this off. It's a little bit distracting, isn't it? Just sharing a few observations with the process so that if you're into this kind of stuff, you want to learn a little bit from me, you'll have the opportunity to do that. First of all, there are a lot of different ideas about what types of solders to use, what types of irons to use. There's probably 10 different kinds of soldering irons, things that use propane, electricity. There are irons shaped more like a gun. There's high voltage irons, there are low voltage irons. For this type of project, what I found to be pretty helpful, pretty successful, is a very low voltage iron. This is the iron that I used. This is a 20 watt. You can see down there in the lower left of that label, this is only 20 watts. Now, when I first started soldering as a kid, I went out and I bought, you know, a big hefty 50, 60 watt iron, big clunky thing from, you know, Home Depot, Menards. Don't recommend doing that. These little tiny irons, for these types of projects with these tiny, tiny little leads built onto these boards are perfectly fine. You don't want to be burning the heck out of this thing, melting all your components, delaminating the leads, sending smoky solder everywhere. These little 20 watt irons are just terrific for getting the job done. Just a note about solder, we all know now how awful lead is, and a lot of the things that lead can do to you, especially adults, especially senior citizens and children. I certainly wouldn't recommend leaded solder. That being said, I know that there are some folks that use it. They claim that it is a superior product. They claim that there's just nothing that comes close to lead. This is not a lead solder. This is a very tiny, tiny gauge solder that I used here. Again, in kind of sticking with that idea of keep the wattage low, the solder small, just a lot more fine control. This is again a Radio Shack product. Lead-free solder, 0.022 inches in diameter. It's very, very thin. It's thinner than the diameter of even a paper clip. So smaller, more control. I've found that this just gives a lot more control. I'm not soldering, you know, 10 gauge wire, huge chunks of metal, just trying to keep things really, really under control. So again, we talked about not melting components, not delaminating, not sending smoke everywhere, but actually looking at, well, and one other thing now that I think of it is that these helping hands are just tremendous. If you're not really well versed into soldering and you're just trying to get into it, I wouldn't even try to solder without this this helping hand contraption. So one of the things that they talk about in this book is the perfect solder joint. Trying to get the your solder joints on these boards should look like volcanoes. You want the solder to be flowing and liquid. However, bearing that in mind, you always want to heat the wire and the pad, the wire of the component in the pad, and not the solder, because you want those components to all be hot to create the correct, I guess it's adhesion, although I don't know if that's the right word, but you want everything to be the same consistent temperature so that the solder will set evenly. It won't be brittle, it won't crack off. So you want this volcano shape. Now, this board had actually been sitting around. I got this at a kind of a makerspace class I took down in Texas, and it had been sitting around in a drawer for 3-4 years. I wasn't really sure what was wrong with it. You know, I figured, who knows, maybe some component was broken on it. The solder looked great. It didn't look like this, but it looked great. I even tested it out with a continuity tester, which was functioning as a multimeter, which was functioning as a continuity tester. Couldn't find any problems. I traced all the leads. It seemed like all the right continuities were working. So I went back and I had read a little bit online and really tried to get these all to be nice and clean. A couple of them had little holes in them. The components weren't, the solder didn't completely cover the holes in the board. But you know, again, I thought, what's the matter? The continuity tester works just great. Anyway, cleaned it up. Really tried to get as many of these as close to little volcanoes as I could, and it seems to be working just fine. So you can't be too careful in trying to get these solder joints to really do exactly what they're supposed to be doing. You can't get this looking too nice, because it seems like it can be tiny little areas of not enough continuity that create these kinds of problems. So you can't be too clean with these joints. One other tip I might add in doing this is that this little guy here was terrific. It is a solder sucker, so you can pull solder back off the board after you've already heated it up and you want to completely redo the joint. It's easier to just apply some new solder than to try to reposition that old solder. You're trying to clean up the joint, get one of these solder suckers. There's also some solder wicks on the market. I can't comment on that. I've never used them, but some folks think they're just great. So just thought I'd put this out there. Kind of just some, you know, pitfalls of a beginner soldering guy. Again, not a profession, not a hobby. Some of you guys might think, oh, you know, this is just child's play. But maybe for someone who's a little more stubborn like me and was convinced that this thing must have been working correctly, well, now you know. Just be very careful and try to get these joints as clean as you possibly can before you try to hit it with a multimeter. Thanks a lot. Hope you guys learned something. Hope you enjoyed the video. Maybe I'll put some more out soon. Take it easy.